Hey, what's up, everybody? Hope you all having a good afternoon. Um, Found this article, and I think it was pretty good read. So, here we go. The history of tensions and solidarity between Black and Asian Americans communities explained. How white supremacy tried to divide Black and Asian Americans, and how communities worked to find common ground. Against the backdrop of anti-racism protests last summer, racist violence was surging in Chinatowns and Asian American communities across the country. In July, an 89-year-old Chinese woman was set on fire while walking on the street after being slapped in the face in Brooklyn, New York. Two witnesses said she didn't say a word before attacking her. She scrambled to put the fire out, but it left a large burn mark on the back of her pink blouse, a grisly reminder of the attack. It was not an isolated incident. Between March 19th and December 31st, 2020, there were more than 2,808 first-hand accounts of anti-Asian hate, according to the report by Stop AAPI Hate, an organization that has been tracking the reports on anti-Asian violence. 150% rise since 2019. From being barred from establishments to being spat on or coughed on, Asian Americans have reported physical and verbal harassment throughout the pandemic, as they've been used as xenophobic scapegoat for the spread of the virus that originated in China. According to one survey conducted last April, 32% of Americans have witnessed someone blaming Asian people for COVID-19, and 60% of Asian Americans have witnessed this behavior. This year, the attacks have seemed to take a more gruesome and visible turn. 61-year-old Filipino man was slashed in the face as he rode the subways in New York. A 64-year-old Vietnamese woman was robbed in a parking lot in San Jose ahead of a lunar in New York. And an 84-year-old Thai man was shoved to the ground in San Francisco, which resulted in his death. These attacks may have been spurred by the coronavirus pandemic, and then Donald Trump, then president, repeatedly using racist terms for the virus, but an anti-Asian sentiment in the United States is not new. Just look to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned Chinese immigrants from becoming U.S. citizens, and President Franklin Roosevelt's executive order in 1942 that put Japanese Americans into internment camps. Donald Trump just, recklessly saying things like the Kung flu, the China virus, things that, were just wrong and inflammatory to say. And unfortunately, most Americans don't really read and don't really understand that, the coronavirus is not, let me put it this way. All Chinese people are not the culprit of the coronavirus. It was the Chinese Communist Party, the government, that is responsible for the coronavirus. Okay? They're the ones that was experimenting on it. They're the ones that let this get out of hand. It went into the wet markets, and then it just went out of control from there. And they're the ones. Okay? They are the ones that are to be held responsible, not the Chinese people. They live in a communist society. There have been doctors, Chinese doctors, Asian doctors who have tried to speak out about the coronavirus, and they have been, in prison, never to be heard from again. Okay? But unfortunately, most of the American population is too, let's say, dumbed down to even read. Okay? When the pandemic emerged and the president began calling the virus Kung flu or China virus, those who are aware of how race operates knew that we were about to experience a surge of racism that we haven't seen in a while, said Pastor Raymond Chang, a founder and president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, a faith-based group advocating for Asian American communities while also leading Black and American and Asian solidarity. Racism against Asian Americans has always been a part of the fabric of our society. It just depends on whether it's overt and violent or subtle and kind of flies under the radar. What also isn't new in times of anti-Asian sentiment is the focus on relations between Black and Asian communities. Many of the attacks that have gained widespread attention have featured Black assailants, have threatened to inflame tensions between Asian Americans and Black Americans. While Vox found no evidence that Black Americans are predominantly responsible for this rise in attacks or that they are particularly hostile to Asian Americans relative to the rest of the population, the narrative of Black Asian hostility is rooted in immigration and economic policies that have historically pitted these communities against one another. In America, what we need to realize is that there's this timeless structure in which there's always one group on top and another group at the bottom. Scott Kershayski, professor and chair of comparative race and ethnic studies at Texas Christian University, told Vox, though there certainly is an unchanged structure in the sense that this country has had a white supremacist ruling class structure since the beginning, it's not the same techniques of governance or the same ideology, and certainly not the same people. Ultimately, there is a failure to remember what got America to this place of racial hierarchies and lingering Black American tensions: white supremacy. White supremacy is what created segregation, policing, and scarcity of resources in low-income neighborhoods, as well as the creation of modern minority myth, all of which have driven the wedge between Black and Asian communities. In fact, it is white Christian nationalism, more than any ideology, that has shaped xenophobic and racist views around COVID-19, according to a recent study. And for Black and Asian American communities to move forward, it is important to remember the root cause and to fight together against it. There's already a long history of Black Asian solidarity against oppression and structural racism, which has been obscured by these recent fissures. In the late 1960s, for instance, Black and Asian activists led the Third World Liberation Front movement to establish race and ethnic studies in college and university curriculums in California. And today, members of both communities are showing up for each other in demonstrations for Black lives and against anti-Asian violence. This is a moment for us to really tell that history, to share that not only Asians and other immigrants and people of color been blamed and scapegoated, but that there's also a history of our community mobilizing and demanding change in action, that we've stood in solidarity together with other communities, said Cynthia Chol, co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, how policy created conditions for Black and Asian tensions. The models we have for understanding and interpreting racism are often oversimplified and led to frustration and resentment. A simple model of racism that casts people as either perpetrators or victims of racism is divorced from the reality that individuals have dozens of identities outside just their race. The fact is that Black Americans are native-born Americans, and like all native-born Americans, they are susceptible to xenophobic and nationalistic sentiments that can be blamed on other, in this case, Asian Americans, who can be seen as forever foreigners, even if they too are native-born. While Black Americans, who are overwhelmingly Democratic, often have more liberal views on immigration reform, there's also existing research that indicates that Black people may feel economic competition with new immigrant communities that can manifest as broad anti-immigrant sentiment and racism. Scholars also highlight that a lot of this competition is due to a racial hierarchy that has placed Black Americans at the bottom. When newcomers enter the country, they encounter a system that reserves the best for the wealthy white Americans, engendering resentment and zero sub-thinking among everyone else for whatever is left. The conflict between Korean Americans and Black Americans is one of the most visible examples of this phenomenon. In 1965, the United States ended the quota-based system of immigration and began to push for high-skilled labor to enter the country. One group that was able to enter the country were Korean Americans, who are hyper-selected. That is, they had much higher socioeconomic and educational attainment relative to not only to their country of origin, but also to the native-born U.S. population. Yen Espiritu, a professor of sociology who specializes in Asian American studies at the University of California, San Diego, explained how this highly educated population came to the United States, was often unable to replicate the social status that they enjoyed in their home country due to the racial discrimination and other barriers. Instead, they found employment as small business owners and opening up shops in predominantly Black communities. Many of these immigrants didn't intend to be small businessmen. The structured context is that Korean immigrants couldn't regain the employment and educational status they once held, as Spirit told Vox. Their proximity to black people was because they were only able to start a business in economically disadvantaged areas. This, coupled with the fact that anti-black racism and financing meant black people often couldn't start their own businesses, sparked bitterness on both sides. It's further added that an additional barrier was that both groups had already been primed to mistrust each other. As Koreans consume American media, they internalized the racist depictions of black Americans as violent, uneducated, and poor. Similarly, black Americans had watched with the rest of America as Koreans were depicted as untrustworthy during the Korean War. Edward T. Chang, a professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, Riverside, explained that the middleman minority theory, which helps further explain the tensions that arose at these Korean-owned businesses. Middleman minority is a term derived from the historical experiences of Jews in Europe and Chinese in Southeast Asia and Asian Indians in Africa. Chang told Vox, middleman minorities exist between dominant and subordinate groups in a society, and often held professions heavily concentrated in the retail and service industries like grocery markets and liquor stores, he explained. These groups often have daily contact with one another in a way that white Americans often do not, due to segregated neighborhoods, shopping centers, and schools. Between the racist stereotypes both groups have internalized and the linguistic and cultural barriers separating them, it's little surprise the continual interactions could lead to conflict. In America's collective memory, the most notable such collision occurred in the 1992 Los Angeles riot, sparked by the acquittal of 4 white LAPD officers after they were videotaped beating Rodney King, a black man. Over the following week, more than 50 people were killed, 1,000 were injured in the uprising that showcased not only anger at the verdict, but also long-standing resentments between black and Korean communities in the LA area. According to CNN, roughly $500 million worth of damage was borne by Korean-owned businesses. Sheesh. Many believe the 1992 riots are emblematic of the relations between black Americans and Asian Americans, despite being the product of specific time and place. After the riots, churches and community organizers worked to educate the two communities on their shared histories of oppression. Many Korean business owners, for example, were unaware of the violence and discrimination blacks have faced in America. Today, more than 9 in 10 Korean Americans believe there is at least some discrimination against black people, according to the survey by Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Meanwhile, 70% of Koreans agree that the government should do more to protect the civil rights of black Americans. Well, that's good to know. White supremacy is at the crux of these tensions, including the model minority myth. According to scholars and activists who have experienced firsthand, black-Asian tensions have obscured America's root problem, white supremacy. Racism and white supremacy have created long-standing rifts between communities of color, Pastor Chang said. The way the system works, the rhetoric around black and Asian tensions will be used to distort the white supremacy that actually drives these tensions. To be white is to sit at the top of America's ruling class. And since darker skin has historically been deemed as undesirable and equated with being poor under Western and Eurocentric views, anyone who is not white falls at the bottom of the hierarchy. In this dominant black-white paradigm, Asian immigrants and Asian Americans have had to find a way to fit in rendering them at risk of visibility. Those who could assimilate into the dominant framework often did, buying into the notions of racial hierarchies and white supremacy, including internalizing racism against their own communities. Unfortunately, that's how it is. As a black man, I was told by family that, you have to work 10 times as harder than a white man to get what you want. And it is true. Okay, there was a couple. She was a lawyer. Her white husband was an artist, and they weren't able to get their house appraised because, they had pictures of, her family in the house. But when they took away the pictures of the black woman's side of the family, and she left with their child for the day, they were able to get the house appraised and for a higher amount of money. Sad to say, she had to do things to get that. They had to do things to get that. She had to be non-existent in the house in order to get in order for them to get their house appraised. This is the racism that a black person faces in an interracial relationship in the housing market. This is what it is. And this is why I really do not pay attention to, Republicans or conservatives who say racism does not exist. Oh, it exists. Sorry, it exists. I don't listen to them at all. Okay. Where was I? All right. But not all Asians are offered this opportunity. The categorization of Asian Americans encompasses roughly 40 ethnicities and a vast range of economic statuses, religions, regions, and cultures. While it's true that Asian Americans are the wealthiest minority group in the country, they also have the widest income gap of any racial group. Myanmarese Americans, for example, have a far higher poverty rate. The other Asian groups, particularly Japanese Americans, and a huge reason for this divide is due to the disparity between Asian American immigrants who arrived in the U.S. with skill-based visas and those who arrived as refugees. Our history is a story of seeking to belong, but finding that our choices were often either erasure or exclusion or assimilation. Pastor Chang said, we ultimately chose to try to fight erasure in the form of assimilation to the degree that made us give up a lot of our cultural heritage when it benefited the broader white society. Basically, for them, for blacks, you have a lot of blacks who would give up their own black culture to talk like white men, act like white men, and even sell out their own kind to please white men. Kind of like in the days of slavery, there was a house Negro and a field Negro. The house Negro, in order to fit in with master, would sell out the slaves the field Negroes who tried to revolt or tried to leave the compound. And you see it with the Skull and Bones and the Boule. The Boule was the black Greek fraternities, and they would work under the white fraternities, Skull and Bones, Alpha Betas and Alpha Kappas and stuff like that. And they would do the bidding of Skull and Bones, the, satanic group. I mean, Boule. And the Boule, in order to keep their wealth and status, they would work to keep the black community down. The Boule would be, Freemasons, civil rights. There would be Freemasons. They would be civil rights leader or pastors. And their job was to keep the black community down. Okay. In order to keep their power, in order to fit in order to assimilate. That's what they did. We have ultimately to choose to try to fight erasure in the form of assimilation to the degree that made us give up a lot of our cultural heritage when it benefited the broader white society. We didn't punish Asians as much, but when Asians are perceived as a threat, they either incarcerated or excluded us altogether. This rush to assimilation is what has perpetuated the model minority myth and helped further racial tensions. The model minority myth took root around the time Japanese Americans were put in internment camps in World War II. Asians were scared of returning or being put into camps, so they remained resistant and were seen as hard workers who, as Joe puts it, have been able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps or overcome barriers. This perpetuated the belief that non-white Americans can succeed and overcome racism in the U.S. without acknowledging the specific historical struggles of Black and Latino Americans and the role of skin color in creating a caste system meant to stoke interracial conflicts. The model minority stereotype really isn't meant to define Asian Americans. Rather, it's meant to define African Americans as deficient and inferior to white people by using Asian Americans as a proxy or pawn to serve that purpose, Kushai told Vox. It was never an accurate portrayal of Asian Americans, but actually consciously meant to distort and stereotype Asian Americans. For example, there are other ethnicities that meet the surface criteria of so-called model minority, but unlikely to be seen that way. According to the research at Columbia University and IC Irving, nearly 2/3 of Nigerian immigrants are college educated, far exceeding the U.S. men at 28%. Like Koreans, Nigerians were defined by hyper-selective migration, But unlike Koreans, they were racialized as black in the U.S. context. Nigerians are not held up as a model, yet more evidence that the minority myth was not about the outcomes of a specific group, but a way to reemphasize the existing racial caste structure and absolve the government of removing the barriers to success for black people. The model minority myth is to Asians what the black criminality myth is to black communities. Any image of black people acting inherently violent toward Asian Americans or other groups of color feeds into the systematic tropes that have long painted black people as criminals, which has been perpetrated by both American media and Asian media platforms like WeChat and Weibo. Last summer, Asian news media furthered the black criminality image during the protests for racial injustice, creating a fear-mongering framework around incidents of looting and violence rather than focusing on largely peaceful protests. In recent months, videos circulated in social media showing elderly Asians getting shoved and attacked, with a few of the attacks perpetrated by black assailants. And the news and social media were quick to put a spotlight on historical and complicated tensions between black and Asian communities. Yeah, for ratings. Again, it's not that these fissures don't exist after decades of white supremacy and inflicted policy. It's just that the emerging narrative has just too easily attributed the violence to these tensions when there are other factors in play. For example, anti-Asian and anti-China sentiment is on the rise globally. From Australia to Europe to Canada, people are registering increasingly hostility toward China and people who think they are Chinese. Not to mention in America, it is white Christian nationalists who are the most likely to say that it isn't racist to call COVID-19 the Chinese virus. It is racist. Okay. Oh boy. Ultimately, the recent rise in anti-Asian attacks have not only reflected the anti-Asian sentiment that has always coursed through America, but also underscores how Asian Americans perceive the model minority status has kept that racism out of the public consciousness for so long. So when Americans need an answer to why this violence is happening, the same way it was quick to blame Asians for the pandemic, the tendency is to scapegoat black people or to claim that these incidents aren't racially motivated. Moving forward through solidarity. As author and activist Helen Zia said, Asian Americans are not missing in action, they are missing in history. And because of this invisibility, Asian Americans are often unaware of their own community's history of activism and solidarity with black communities and other communities of color. While the decades-long acculturation to a predominantly white society will take a lot of work to undo, the intergenerational gap between Asian Americans who have absorbed anti-black sentiment and younger U.S.-born Asians who are much more willing to speak out against injustice will play a major role in this shifting narrative. And it starts with looking at the moments of solidarity that have come before. In his book, Shifting Grounds of Race, Black and Japanese Americans in the Making of Multi-Ethnic Los Angeles, Kishi examines the coexistence of Black and Japanese Americans in Los Angeles before, during, and after World War II, going back to the creation of the model minority myth. While Japanese Americans were incarcerated in camps, Black folks from the Jim Crow South migrated west to Los Angeles and settled in spaces that were previously occupied by Japanese Americans. After being released from internment camps, Japanese Americans found themselves having to integrate with Black counterparts. Fearing being put back in camps, they tried to prove themselves worthy of earning back their constitutional rights by working hard. As policing and white fearmongering intensified in these communities, Japanese Americans were further invoked as a model minority for being able to rise up economically after the internment. But that size didn't equivocally translate into divides between Japanese American and Black communities themselves. This state cites stories of an African American elder who delivered care packages and letters to his Japanese friends when they were first put into temporary assembly centers before they were interned, and another story of a Black woman who went to high school yearbook copies, who sent high school yearbook copies to her Japanese American classmates who had been put in camps. When politicians and media stoked fears of race riots upon Japanese Americans being released from the internment, one Black activist told the media, "I have nothing against the return of the Japanese." A friend who was a waitress at this cherished, now demolished bowling alley in Crenshaw in Los Angeles said she would serve udon noodles to African American customers who were having lunch with Japanese American friends eating grits. Kushu said, You can find solidarity moments like this all over the place when we shift the framework. We can still be concerned about racism and white supremacy, but we don't have to center whiteness and white ideologies all the time. Moments of solidarity between both communities are even more widespread and out in the open today. Like many Americans this summer, Asian Americans rallied around Black Lives Matter protests and vowed to integrate anti-Blackness within their communities. I'm tired of the Asian community being quiet or missing in the action when it's time to side with our Black brothers and sisters. One Asian American activist who joined the Black Lives Matter protests in Austin, Texas, told Vox, and now Black activists have joined the fight at recent rallies in New York, California, calling the attention to the resurgence of anti-Asian violence. Heartwarming videos circulated on social media showing Black people chanting things like, "We all on the streets fighting for Asian lives." Healing is happening at the community level too. Last May, Pastor Chang had led an effort to bring back Black and Asian communities together by hosting a 3-part panel series titled Interconnected, in which they discuss racial biases and the deep-rooted history of Black and Asian conflicts. And in the aftermath of the policing killing of George Floyd, Ray brought together 2 churches a mile apart from each other, an African-American church and an Asian American church, to lead a historically solidarity march for Black lives in Chicago. I agree with the sentiment of Black Lives, but Black Lives Matter is a damn joke. The movement is a damn joke. And I'm kind of looking at this with a side eye sometimes. I just am. If you take a holistic look at our history, I truly believe that Asian Americans have more in common with African American community than with the white community in America. That is true. I don't argue that. Pastor Chang said, the fact that many people don't know that shows how historically malnourished we are and how fragmented our understanding of history is. In addition to understanding this history, Alicia Garza, oh boy, founder of Black Lives Matter and principal of Black Futures Lab, said it's important to continue fostering these interracial relationships. Without these interracial relations and solidarity movements, she said, white nationalists will end up benefiting if Black and Asian communities are seen at conflict with each other instead of addressing the overall problems of systematic racism and white supremacy head on. Boy. I understand, but Alicia Garza is not someone to be trusted. None of these founders of Black Lives Matter are to be trusted. We need to make sure that we're not falling into the wedges and the traps that get set for us, Garza said. There's a long history of solidarity in Black communities and Asian communities. Those relations are needed more than ever. In this moment of racial reckoning, Garza, Pastor Chang, and Cho, and others say it's imperative to have difficult and uncomfortable yet meaningful conversations across all racial groups to understand one another's collective struggles. We have to enter into the stories of other people and understand how their communities have been shaped and formed and why they are the way they are. Pastor Chang said that comes through learning, unlearning, and relearning. And because there's a lot of misconception on this misunderstanding around how we actually got to where we are today. Ultimately, the pandemic has exposed the cracks in American society, bringing forth the layers of systematic racism and legacies of injustice that many Americans have chosen not to pay attention until now. And it's not only up to Black and Asian American communities to do the work of building solidarity, it's the responsibility of all Americans to understand the role that white supremacy has played in creating these rifts that are exploited again and again. The crisis for me is not that there's intractable clash of cultures between Black and Asian Americans, Cassidy said. The crisis is the systematic, it is COVID-19, the persistence of white nationalism, police brutality, and these really anti-human discourses and practices that are at the center of so much of what's wrong with our country's history. We need to dramatic change, he added. Radical solutions never come from the top down. They start with groups at the grassroots level breaking through the status quo. I agree, but I could never really trust. You can't trust Black Lives Matter. You can't trust them at all. You cannot trust Black Lives Matter because those people are snakes, all 3 of them. Alicia Garza, and the other one, I forgot her name. I forgot her name just off the bat. Good grief. Alisa Garza and Patrice Cullors. Yeah, you cannot trust them at all. Okay, but I do believe that white supremacy has to be dealt with, because that is the reason why blacks and Asians suffered so much in history, and why there was tension between blacks and Asians in this country. And due to Donald Trump saying, "Oh, China virus or the Kung flu," really making obnoxious and foolish comments like that. Okay. And I do believe, yes, Donald Trump, is a racist. I do believe that. If you can make, comments like that, and you don't think people are going to, do something stupid, just inflame the public to do something stupid, you're nuts. And that's what he did. He did something like that. He did something like that to inflame, to start the racial tension. Okay. But I do hope tensions between the black community and the Asian community, it does cease, hopefully. But you'll always have those who are ignorant that want to try and stoke the flames of violence and hatred. Well, that's all I got for today. Talk to you tomorrow. Like, share, comment, and subscribe if you like the commentary. All right. Later. Oh, yeah. And I will be trying to work on having an interview with a YouTuber that I found. I will be trying to. She talks about how white supremacy works to keep blacks down, and how there are Asians that are complicit in that white supremacy. So I want to talk to her. She's Asian herself. Hopefully I can get an interview with her. And, wish me luck. Wish me luck that I could get time to do that interview. That'd be great, right? You see some commentary. All right. Later.